Okay, so now that we've completed bones and have a good idea about your skeletal system, its functions, how it works, the names of all these parts, before we move into muscles and skeletal muscles, what we'll really focus on, and we start looking at moving the bones, we have to look at another aspect, which isn't really a system, but is an important it's an important component of what we think of as a musculoskeletal system. So the cooperation between muscles and bones, and that is articulations, your joints, right? So where bones come together, and the cool thing is this really very very easily supports this idea of structure reflecting function. All right, and so when you look at these bones, and you look especially at the long bones and their epiphyses where they're articulating, or the vertebra and their facets where they're articulating, you really get a feel for just exactly what kind of movement you could do because of the way it looks. All right. So I say, one resounding, returning and reoccurring theme here is that we are going to trade off. So stability, the more stable we are, the less mobile we'll be. All right, so there's kind of, look for that theme too. All right, there are three basic groupings for our joints, and that's the fibers, the cartilage, or a joint cavity. All right, and that's going to have to do with synovial joints. So we're going to categorize them based on, this is kind of a structural, right? So more collagen, more cartilage, and kind of a mix of a few things, but that includes fluid in a space. And the way they function. So there's going to be a couple different ways we're going to group them and think about them to try to remember them and apply them, right, to the ability to move. All right, so here's the types of joints I said, the functional and the structural. So functional categories really determine the degree of motion. So they are named for how much motion they have. So there'll be basically no motion, a little bit of motion, and then quite a few ranges of motion. And then structural is going to be, again, the major type of connective tissue and fluids. All right? So in the functional category, synarthrosis, and these will all have this word root arthrosis in it. So syn is adjoining. So synarthrotic joints are joints that are basically not going to move, right? They're joined together. Examples of things are like the sutures in the skull and gynphoses between the teeth and the maxillary bone or the mandibular bone. Amphiarthritis, when something has amphi, it's got some capabilities. So there's a slight degree of mobility in an amphiarthritic joint. Oftentimes, this is one like the cartilage pads that you find between the coxa and between the individual bodies of the vertebra, right? And then there's a few other examples of this, but they have a little bit of motion, but they really are there for, again, remember, stability. All right? And then the last category of functional joint is a diarthrotic or diarthrosis. And this gives, there's a range of motion associated with these, so it's not just freely movable, but they are all capable of movement. So not no movement and not slight movement. They all move. And therefore we put all of our synovial joints into the category of diarthrotic. Okay? If you're structural, you can be fibrous. And again, fibrous joints are like the sutures and gynphoses, and they are, again, a lot of fibrous joints are synarthrotic. Cartilaginous, and so this is going to be a cartilage pad in the joint. Again, the pubis symphysis and the symphysis between the vertebral bodies is a good example of this. Slight movement. And then the synovial joints, again, are the joint cavities. They have space in there, just a small amount, a little bit of fluid. And this, of course, lubricates these moving parts and allows a little bit more movement between the bones. Okay, so here we're depicting this, in a nice cartoon, this idea of synarthrotic, amphiarthrotic, and diarthrotic. Okay, so here in these sutures, and here we specifically look at the coronal between the frontal bone and the parietal, or the squamous or squamous, and lamboid, so lamboid between occipital and parietals, and squamous is separates the temporal bone. Okay, these are all a type of synarthrotic joint. All right, and then they're very protective. Everything stays together. It's not moving, and we've got a good stability there. The manubriosternal joint, right, is also an example of this. All right, so not shown here, but that's also a synarthrotic. It's not going to move, right, and we're going to keep that. It's going to give us support. It's a nice foundation for, a foundation for your costals. All right. Limited mobility. Well, here's these intervertebral discs, these pads of cartilage. And I give you an example again, the pubic symphysis. These are also called symphysis, and they're between the vertebral bodies, right? And then we talk about the synovial joints, which they're always diarthrotic. Here's a certain kind we call a ball and socket, and that's just showing, cartoon what that looks like. So in the diarthrotic joints, and these are synovial joints as well, we have three basic categories. We talk about a uniaxial, biaxial, and multiaxial. And this has to do with the number of planes that the joint can move in. Now here in this ball and socket, we move 360 degrees, so that is clearly a multiaxial plane. But there will be other synovial joints that don't have as much mobility. And there'll even be one that is more mobile. It's still a ball and socket, but it's more mobile, and that's your shoulder joint. Okay, so we've introduced it. Let's reinforce this idea of fibrous joints. Okay, so here in our image we have the sutures, we have the gum fosses between tooth and bone, and then we have another one we call the syndesmosis. So this is actually a sheet of fibrous connective tissue between these two bones, radius and ulna, and we also see this between the tibia and the fibula. Okay, so here in a fibrous joint, we say the bone's united by dense fibrous tissue. That's where it gets its name, which is collagen. And they have very little of any movement, so they're typically, again, a synarthrotic joint. They're subclassified, as we said, as syndesmosis, sutures, or gum fosses. The syndesmosis, again, is separated. Two bones are separated by, a small distance, and they're held together, so they really function as a singular bone in that sense. So your forearm and your leg, this is true for. So held together by ligaments, and ligaments connect bone to bone, or interosseous, so between bones membranes. These are amphiarthrotic, so again, gum fosses and sutures are synarthrotic, but syndesmosis turns out they have a little bit of mobility. All right, so the sutures and gum fosses, just to look at them a little again, flexible at birth due to membranes. So at birth, and we should look at this skull in lab because we are going to use this on the practical. There are, your fetal skull have these fontanelles instead of sutures. So the plates that are going to become the skull bones have not, grown together and fused. They are still separated, and we can clearly see the tough, dense connective tissue between the plates. All right, and so the fontanelles are really named for location. All right, we see consistently the posterior fontanelle and the anterior fontanelle, and so those are ones I feel comfortable asking you guys on your lab practical. Okay, so again, and these are synarthrotic. Gum fosses, which would be between the teeth and the maxillary or mandibular, they are also synarthrotic, and we have these we have the ligaments that hold them, periodontal ligaments that hold them in place, but teeth and skull bones are not moving around, right? Cartilaginous. So here we see an example also, we didn't include here, that between parts. So this is an example of a joint that's actually within a bone. This of course happens within the long bones as they are getting longer. And so I can't say that it's really uncommon, but it is uncommon from a joint standpoint because it's a joint that's not between two or more bones. It's a joint within a bone. So very interesting in that sense. So cartilaginous, we see here the pubic symphysis, and again the epiphyseal plate here inside the bone. So hyaline cartilage, is common in these. Fibrocartilage is also found, but cartilage, that's why they're called cartilaginous. They generally have only slight movement, but this has really none. So don't, again, they don't all have to be amphiarthrotic, but a lot of times they are. Okay, so found in the epiphyseal plates between ribs and costal cartilage. All right, so remember the ribs, we talked about the true, the false ribs. We don't have to mention the floaters because they don't have a connection. But within the true and the false ribs, as the bone ends and becomes kind of a bands of cartilage, that's actually considered a cartilaginous joint. And then between the coxa, which is here. Okay, so synchondrosis or symphysis are the names, just like gomphoses and suture and syndesmoses were the names of the fibrous joints. So synchondrosis, in here you see chondro, which is cartilage, and this is a synchondrotic joint. These pads are symphysis joints, and those are specific types of cartilaginous joints. All right, so here I just talk a little bit more about this idea that the synchondrosis, again, joined by cartilage, so syn is together. They're a hyaline cartilage, or the bone is united to hyaline cartilage. Okay, sometimes they're temporary structures, so that was the epiphyseal plate back here. Temporary, it'll go away. When ossification occurs, I say it actually becomes a synostosis or ostotic joint. There we go. Ooh, like I'm a FUD here. Okay, which are again synarthrotic. All right, so they're not going to be moving around, right? Because synarthrotic are the immobile joints. All right, there's a joint between the ilium, ischium, and pubis, though we call it collectively the coxa, right? But there are joints somewhere in this vicinity between them, and they are types of synchondrotic and synarthrotic. Between the manubrium and the first rib, all right, it is synarthrotic, it's not moving. I said the rest of the costal cartilage to sternum are synovial. So, all right, the costals to the cartilage, as we said previously, right, between ribs and costal cartilage, are cartilaginous. But then where that costal cartilage meets here, so here again, this, right, would be a cartilaginous joint, and these would typically be synovial with the exception of this one. So between the manubrium and the first rib, this is a synarthrotic joint. Okay, but between the rest of the pieces of cartilage and the sternum, this is all synovial joints. Okay, so the other 11 ribs and costal cartilages are also synchondrosis. So this is, again, we're talking about this end, so don't get confused by, I didn't just contradict myself. It's a matter of we have a joint here and a joint here and a band of cartilage in between. So synchondrotic here, all right, the costal sternum synovial. All right, the symphysis, the bones are joined by a pad of fibrocartilage, so there's a little bit more collagen in this, and that strengthens it. They have limited movement, so we call them amphiarthrotic, and this includes, right, the manubriosternal, the pubic, right, pubis, and called the pubic symphysis, and intervertebral. So manubriosternal is talking about this joint here. Okay, so we'll end the video and we'll pick up and talk about synovial joints the rest of the chapter.